All right. Hello, everyone. This is what do sexual assault cases look like in our community? The case file workbook for sexual assault teams webinar. We are so excited to have you today and to be talking about this topic. We're very excited to be launching our case file review workbook through this webinar and have all your questions answered throughout case file review, or about case file review, I should say. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about our objectives today. We have 3 objectives today. Our first is to review systems change work and the role of evaluation within sexual assault response teams. Then we're going to spend some time discussing the case file review process as an evaluation process and really focus on what evaluation looks like within sexual assault response teams. Before finally going through briefly our revised case file review workbook and determining if your team is ready for case file review. A few housekeeping things. One, I want to point out that this webinar is part of our rural project, and this project is supported by the Office of Violence Against Women. So we want to thank them for all of their support in the work that we do. As well as feel free to use the chat and Q&A features throughout this webinar. This webinar is going to be recorded and available at a later date, as well as we do have ASL interpretation here today. So feel free to ask questions and interact with each other as we go along. My name is Miranda Gonzalez, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the rural project coordinators here at the Sexual Violence Justice Institute, which is based in Min Casa. I've been in this position for almost 2 years now, which is wild to me. But before that, I worked as a legal advocate in a duo service organization. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll have my colleague Fatima introduce herself as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Fatima Hayoma. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the other rural project coordinator here at SBJI at Min Casa. Similar to Miranda, I also provide training and technical assistance to rural SARTs and multidisciplinary teams and state-level TA leaders across the country.
I do also want to point out really quickly that we have a tech support person here who is labeled as tech support SVJI at Min Casa. So if you have any challenges with tech, feel free to message them as well.
Perfect. So before we start, I'm going to share a little bit about our work here at Min Casa. So Min Casa is a statewide coalition driving transformative culture change to address sexual violence through advocacy, prevention, racial justice, and systems change. Here at Min Casa, we envision a world free of sexual violence in which all human beings are treated with dignity and respect, and communities are transformed through safety, healing, and partnerships. A little bit about our work. So we do advocacy. We provide leadership and resources to advocates in providing services to all victim survivors in their communities. We also do prevention work. So we work to prevent harm and address root causes of sexual violence using an anti-oppression lens. We also do racial justice work. So we are working towards a Minnesota where BIPOC survivors have access to safety, affirmation, and systems they can trust and use. And finally, we do systems change and policy work. So we invest in community-focused work alongside our efforts to transform systems, prioritizing underserved communities. So people often wonder what is Min Casa and what is SBJI. So Min Casa is a statewide coalition that is driving transformative culture change to address sexual violence through advocacy, prevention, racial justice, and systems change. So what is SBJI? SBJI is a national program operating within Min Casa, and our work really focuses on creating long-term sustainable systems responses to sexual violence that meet the specific needs of each community. We have 5 values that guide the work we do, and those 5 values are collaboration, integrity, courageous and bold action, prevent harm, and social justice. So a little bit about what we can offer you. So we do training. So that looks like webinars, workshops, conferences, and training on special topics. Our largest conference is the National Institute for SART Leaders, and that occurs every other year. Like I mentioned, we also do webinars like this one today, but we also have webinars on protocol writing, evaluation, virtual engagement, and much more. We also create resources. So we have a lot of templates, fact sheets, blogs, toolkits, and guidebooks. And we also provide support. This is sometimes also referred to as technical assistance. This is where we can assist you with brainstorming issues, meeting facilitation or meeting planning, and just general problem solving. So we really try our best to support you with any issues you are experiencing within your SART. And finally, we are here as the point of connection. So we are here to connect you to other experts. So that includes TA providers, peers, and mentors. To help build connections, we actually host monthly connection calls. And for those not familiar with those calls, they're virtual Zoom calls where we gather SART coordinators and state-level TA leaders across the country and have discussions that address the current needs of SARTs. And it's also just a place to connect with other SART leaders. So unfortunately, we haven't had a call yet this year, but you will be hearing from us soon about our spring calls.
All right. I recognize that folks have been introducing themselves in the chat. Thank you for doing that. Feel free to continue to introduce yourself. And along with that, I would love for folks to chat in, answering the question, what is one thing that you would like to learn or have answered about case file review today? So I'll give everyone a moment to think about those answers. All right, so someone chatted in what the correct protocols are. Yeah, how to do it. What else are folks interested in learning or talking about today? Great. How to use case file review in a very small area where everyone knows everyone. Yeah. How to get more engagement for case reviews. How long does one case file review generally take? Awesome. We're going to talk about that. Effective and efficient strategies to complete reviews. Can it be combined with an intake assessment? Where to find the documents. Few folks are chatting in how often it should be done. Advocate confidentiality. What exactly is it? Yep. How to get started with case reviews in a rural area with a new SART for a faith community. Yeah. How would jurisdiction play a role? Awesome. Okay. Well, I'm so excited, and I hope that we can get all of your questions answered. This is really an opportunity for general overview of case file review, and give folks like an opportunity to really understand what we are talking about when we are discussing case review. And with that, Fatima is going to talk a little bit generally about systems change and how that plays a role in our process.
Thank you, Miranda. So yes, as mentioned in the objective slide, before we talk about case review, we are quickly going to talk about creating systems change. This will just help us frame our case file review work. So what is systems change? Systems change is working towards improving individual systems responses to sexual violence while also increasing collaboration between the systems. So systems change SARTs are really focusing on enhancing the strengths of practice, policy, procedures, and collaboration between systems. At the same time, they are working to address the shortcomings of the practice, policy, procedures, and collaboration. This is all while ensuring support and engagement for victim survivors throughout all the processes and continuously improving over time as communities are changing. So at SBJI, we have developed a continuous improvement model on how to do systems change work. We call it the 3 phases of system change. And these phases, we believe, can guide teams as they work together to improve their responses to sexual violence. The first phase, we have assess the status quo. And assess the status quo focuses on learning about the current responses and experiences of victim survivors. So in this phase, a team's goal is really to determine a meaningful area of impact or change. So here, your teams are really identifying strengths, gaps, and barriers that need to be addressed. So this phase can look like an inventory of existing providers or community mapping. So learning about which services or community spaces survivors are accessing. This can also be really helpful for teams to show which groups or disciplines are not currently at the table. This phase must also focus on centering victim survivors. So this looks like bringing in the voices of victim survivors and learning directly from them about their experience. Something that a team can also do is conduct a community needs assessment. So this allows teams to really learn about their communities and what strategies are currently in place to address sexual violence and to respond to it. So hopefully through doing a community needs assessment, a team is able to identify an area of improvement. So again, this phase looks like many different activities, and those are just 3. We have a much longer list, and if you're interested in seeing a larger list or having a conversation about the different stages, please do reach out to Miranda or I. The second phase is make change. So this focuses on using the information that you've gathered in the first phase and making targeted improvements. So when SARTs are doing systems change work, most want to jump right into this phase. So this is the most exciting phase for a lot of teams. But there is a reason why this is the second phase, and that's because in order to make impactful change, we have to take the time to learn what is actually happening in our communities. So this phase involves using the information you collected in the first phase and selecting and prioritizing what needs to change about the response. So this can look like developing or revising interagency protocol, identifying training needs, and creating programs, tools, and resources for your community. And the third phase, so this is measure the change. So the measure the change phase focuses on checking the effectiveness or outcomes of the changes made in the second phase. So this is the final phase. This is when teams are measuring the impacts and outcomes from the changes made. So many folks are intimidated by this phase, but it is just as important as the first two. So this is actually what Miranda will be talking about in a couple slides. But to give you a little bit of a preview, this phase helps teams understand how the changes have impacted the response to the community and to the victim survivors who have experienced the change. So an example of what this can look like, it could look like monitoring implementation of change. It can look like assessing gaps and barriers that exist because of the change. It can look like doing surveys or focus groups in your community. And finally, it can look like the topic of today's webinar, case file review. So again, this is just a super quick overview of systems change work. It really, talking about this helps us frame how we view case file review. And finally, here on the slide, you see systems change is a cyclical process. As I mentioned earlier, it is a continuous learning model. So when systems change starts are learning about their communities, they are also continuously making changes that need to best meet the needs of victim survivors and checking the outcome of the changes made. So just a quick summary of that. Teams assess the status quo, teams make change, teams measure change, and then they return to that first phase. So once a team has completed this process, they start back up in the first phase again and assess and make new change.
All right, thanks, Fatima, for that overview of systems change work. So as Fatima mentioned, we are going to be spending the majority of this webinar talking about evaluation. We at SBJI like to think of case file review as one type of evaluation and one process of evaluation. So we'll spend a few moments going over what evaluation looks like in teams in general. But before we get started, I have a poll for all of you to answer. And that is, how comfortable are you with evaluation in SART work? So we'll give a moment for it to launch. There we go. So very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, neutral, I'm still learning, or I am uncomfortable with evaluation. We'll give just a couple more moments for people to respond. All right, and I see the response rate is going down a little bit, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. All right, so it looks like we have some people that are very comfortable with evaluation, and we have some people that are also very uncomfortable with evaluation. where most folks are kind of falling into those categories of neutral or still learning about evaluation. And I would say that's pretty typical, right? Evaluation is not necessarily something that we think about doing every day. And it can be an intimidating process, especially as we're just beginning to learn it. All right. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what evaluation is. So essentially, evaluation is just gathering information in a mindful and active way, right? It's the active process of listening and learning and reflecting on what that information looks like. Typically, evaluation has specific predetermined approaches. So for case file review, there are specific steps that teams can take in order to complete a case file review process. Judgments are made from established criteria. So oftentimes, as part of the evaluation process, you're planning kind of different levels of criteria and different information that you're looking for. And then evaluation is also used as evidence for future decision making. So when we're thinking about systems change work as a cyclical process, an evaluation really following in that measuring the change piece, that evaluation or taking the time to evaluate really focuses on launching teams into the next phase of systems change and restarting that process. I do also want to point out that we have our general evaluation guidebook. Heather, I think, is going to drop that in the chat. Thank you. Called Are We Making a Difference? That goes over evaluation and various methods of evaluation in general. So that's a resource for everyone. All right. Why we do evaluation. Essentially, it helps us determine the strengths and limitations within our response. So it's one of the core pieces of systems change work. It allows teams to examine their own practices and protocols and really focus on what things look like in their community, as well as investigate the effects. So for example, if your team has developed a protocol, evaluation and doing evaluation is a way that we can learn whether or not our protocol is working as we expect it to, as well as look at the impacts of the response and the changes in the response as well. So I do really want to point out that evaluation is an essential component of systems change work. When we are thinking about evaluation as it relates to case file review, we're really looking at outcome assessment. So this is essentially looking at the what, the effects, and the impacts. And I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about the difference between effects and impacts. So effects, oftentimes we're thinking about it in the sense of the direct result of our changes versus the impacts is like the secondary result or the secondary effect. So an example is if you train an entire emergency department at a hospital about trauma-informed practices, the effect might be the changed behavior among ER staff, but the impact is hopefully a better experience for victim survivors who present at this ER. So when we're thinking about case file review, we're thinking about, yes, those direct changes that might be documented in the case notes, but then also expanding it to think about and reflect on the impact of those changes as well. And the victim survivors' experience of the response to sexual violence within your community. The purpose of outcome assessment is essentially to collect and establish evidence of our good work and to really see the changes. I think a lot of times we can get stuck in looking at the limitations of our work, but oftentimes doing this outcome assessment, you can really focus on the success and really reinforce the good work that you're already doing. For example, if you're new to the SART world and your team is just forming, one outcome assessment could be looking at the relationships that or the relationships between disciplines is what I should say. And really looking at how those relationships have improved since the team has formed. So again, it's really focusing on kind of the results. Some outcome assessment questions include, what did we intend to have happen? So this is often done with protocol work, and it can be often a question asked with case file review. What actually happened? Is our protocol being implemented as we expect it to in our cases? Is our protocol being documented in our cases? What explains the difference in intentions and what happened? Is reality the same as our theory when it comes to our protocol? And lastly, what would we do differently next time? And this is, again, a question that could launch us into that next cycle of systems change work. And these are all questions that teams can ask themselves while completing a case file review. All right, now I know we have spent a lot of time talking generally about evaluation and systems change work, and I recognize that everyone is here to talk about case file review. So now we're gonna go into a bit more detail about case file review and that process. So when we think about case file review, here at SBJI, we define case file review as the systematic process of examining case files and identifying themes within the criminal legal response. Case file review can be used to determine compliance or deviance from established policies and protocols. And it can also include a determination of gaps and barriers to an effective community response to sexual assault. So this is a couple of things I want to point out about this definition is that the case file review process is really focused on the criminal legal response to sexual violence in your community. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail later in the presentation, but I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we're talking. Oftentimes, I see case file review as a method used to assess protocols that teams have developed. So really, when we're thinking about when is the right time to do case file review and answering some of those questions, or how to do case file review, one of the questions that I ask teams to think about is, do you have a protocol, and what does that protocol look like? This gives us time to really think about what we're assessing and what we're evaluating with case file review. I've been using the word case a lot, and I recognize that depending on your discipline or organization or even your role, case as a word can be used in a couple of different ways. So for purposes of this webinar, when I am sharing or using the word case, I'm usually discussing it in terms of case notes created by a criminal legal professional. So that could be a law enforcement police report. It could include prosecutor notes as it relates to the response. Depending on your community, that case is going to be larger or smaller, and also depending on conversations you have within your team, could include or disclude certain information. But oftentimes when we think about it as a police report. When we're thinking about different types of case information to review, there are two main types. The first is single case review. Oftentimes, this is active case management, where you are looking at one situation within your community and really doing a deep dive into that particular case. This can also be done as case presentation or case consultation. So both discussing the case as it is occurring, and then also looking at the case individually after it has made its way through the criminal legal response. Oftentimes, when we're thinking about doing a single case, we're thinking about it using an acute response method, where we're really focused on how that response worked for that one individual situation. I do want to point out, in rural communities, sometimes we only have one or two cases of sexual violence that we can look at, in which case a single case review might be appropriate, because sometimes we just don't have the information. On the other hand, multiple cases is also looking at as systems consultation. So this is when you're taking multiple cases that have occurred, sometimes throughout years, sometimes over a span of 6 months, depending on your community. This is what we think of when we are talking about case file review. There's typically more than one case. I like to say usually around 5 to 8 cases, but again, it really depends on your community and what you decide to review as a team. You're really looking at, with a multiple case file review, the systems response. So instead of looking at that specific situation, you're looking for patterns within the response that have been documented through case notes. One example of this that I've often seen and read in law enforcement reports is when law enforcement is contacting advocacy or medical forensics, and that's documented in the case notes. How long did that connection take to make? So was law enforcement able to get a hold of advocacy right away, or did it take multiple times to call? It's just an example of what we're looking at when we think of systems response. So for the majority of the remainder of this webinar, we'll be talking about case file review as it relates to reviewing multiple cases. But I do want to call out that single case review is sometimes your option for case file review, as well as it is another form of evaluation. It just looks slightly differently. So a few reasons why teams want to do case file review. Oftentimes, it is to evaluate the current policies and practices of SART agencies. So again, looking at that protocol development, it's really to focus on what does the protocol look like in our community. It can also be used as a method to identify and implement strategies for sexual assault cases to be investigated and documented in a trauma-informed and victim survivor way. So when teams do this, oftentimes they're looking at the language that is used within the police report and within the case notes, and how sexual assault is described, and how language is being used to document the case. So it's really focused on documentation and language. Another form, or another reason why teams do case file review is to compare how the criminal legal response to sexual violence has changed. So an example could be if your team has been around for 5-10 years, taking cases that occurred before the team has formed and looking at what those case notes looked like and what the response looked like according to the case notes, and comparing it to case notes of more current or present day, and how differences may or may not have occurred within the response between those two cases. So that's one kind of comparison example. And then lastly, some teams that we have worked with have used case file review as a training method for member disciplines. So when we first started doing case file review, back in like 2013, I want to say, we did have and worked with one team in particular where law enforcement invited all of their recruits to the case file review process with the team, and it was used as a learning opportunity. I do want to point out that I would say that is a more unusual way to use case file review. And if you're using it as a training method, you do want to ensure that your team has strong relationships. I think an overall theme of doing case file review and determining whether or not your team is ready for case file review is really looking at the relationships between the team members to see if the team is ready to complete this process. All right, so I am going to ask Heather to drop in the chat our newly revised 2022 case file review workbook. So a little bit of background on this workbook is we have been doing case file review for several years. However, we just revised our case file review guidebook into a workbook, and I'll talk a little bit about that format shortly, but this way folks can kind of browse through the resource as I'm talking about how the case file review workbook is set up. I won't be going through every single activity because we would be here for quite some time, but I will be kind of doing a general overview as far as what the new workbook looks like, as well as pointing out some of the larger revisions that we have made. So the case file review workbook is divided into 4 different sections: plan, do, reflect, and apply. These are the same sections that are in our evaluation guidebook that Heather put in the chat earlier. The chapters don't follow these sections directly. So the 4 chapters of the workbook are foundations, preparations, which are both in that plan section, case file review, which is the do section, and then analyze and developing recommendations, which is in the reflect and apply sections, have been combined into one chapter. So I'm going to be spending a lot of time talking about the planning section because these 2 chapters, I would say, take the most time out of the case file review process. So when we're thinking about planning, this oftentimes takes several meetings where team members are communicating with each other and their own discipline before the case file review process actually takes place. So first is our foundations chapter, where teams really discuss whether or not case file review is the best form of evaluation for them. Right? This is the point where teams really decide, is this the type of evaluation we want to do, or is there another method we would like to look at instead? Teams also will spend time developing their anchor question, which is essentially their focus of the case file review process. Looking at data and reflecting on data can get very overwhelming very quickly. And so by developing an anchor questions, teams can really determine what they want to learn about when doing the case file review process. There's also opportunities for team members to really gather their leadership buy-in and ensure that their leadership is on board, as well as the chapter ends with a readiness assessment. So teams can feel confident that they are ready to move forward within that preparation chapter. Our preparations chapter is probably the largest chapter of the guidebook. And it starts by discussing various leadership roles within the case file review process so that team members can decide what works best for them, and also all the different logistical elements and components that it comes to doing an evaluation process like case file review. This is also where teams will develop agreements for their discussion. Case file review and any evaluation process, when you're looking at actions within your community, conflict can come up, and teams, before that conflict comes up, can be prepared for how we're going to communicate in between various disciplines and team members. At this point, teams can also determine what cases they would like to review and set parameters out of in regards to what specific cases will be pulled to review. Next, teams will talk about confidentiality and redaction and make decisions as far as how confidentiality of various disciplines will be upheld, as well as what information needs to be redacted from cases in order to maintain that confidentiality. Once those decisions are made, oftentimes we'll see whatever agency is sharing their case files will go back to either their records department or another form of administration and begin pulling and redacting cases as teams continue to have conversations. Next, teams will spend some time really making sure that they are on the same page by developing shared language, revisiting their values, and also practicing giving and receiving feedback. So this again can be done over multiple team meetings, but it is really time for teams to have what can be sometimes challenging conversations. Lastly, before teams do the case file review, they will develop specific analysis tools, either through the form of a checklist and or an observation form, so that they really feel prepared when doing case file review. And we like to end this preparations chapter as well with a discussion as far as how the team is going to tend to their wellness, because this is a long and extensive process, and it does take time, and we want to make sure that all team members are taking care of themselves. When it comes to the foundations and preparations chapter, depending on your team and the conversations that you need to have, it might look slightly differently. So this is just kind of an overview as far as what we recommend, but some teams need to have more conversations and some teams need to have less conversations. It just kind of depends on your relationships. Next, we have our do. This is where we actually get into the case file review. And part of that action process is practicing doing a case file review with a mock review. So within our workbook, we do have a mock case in the form of a police report that teams can use to practice all of their different tools and how they have determined parameters around conversations. As well as our do chapter has a sample schedule for logistics and preliminary themes where teams can record what they are seeing. In our reflect section, teams are able to really look at their findings. And when we're thinking about that reflecting and listening and learning piece, it's really focused on, trying to think of the right word. It's really focused on like finalizing your findings and solidifying what the team has learned from case file review. And then finally apply, where teams take time to sit down and think about action steps and what they have learned throughout this entire process. So when thinking about this workbook and all the conversations that take place, I like to say that the case file review process takes about 10 to 15 months. That sounds like a long time. Another way to look at it is about 10 to 12 meetings, depending on your team and depending on how you would like to logistically sit down and do the case file review itself. Going into the workbook in a little bit more detail, I'm going to spend some time comparing and contrasting our revised copy of the workbook, which you all have, compared to the workbook that was on the website yesterday. So this is the first time that we have dropped the workbook, and we're very excited for it. Previously, our case file review guidebook was designed as a lesson plan for the site coordinator. Instead, we have transferred the format of the workbook. So it is a team document that all team members can interact with. So it is activity-based, and each activity is divided into 3 different sections. The first is background, which provides any information the team may need in order to complete the activity or to have that facilitated conversation. Next is objectives, which is where teams can really discover what the point of the activity is and why that conversation may be important. And then lastly, how to use it, which is how teams interact with the activity below. It is a resource for the entire team. So the goal is that any team member could pick up your team's copy of the case file review workbook and interact with it and learn from it. Not necessarily just the site coordinator as compared to the previous copy. It also creates a historical document for the teams. So our current guidebook is interactive, and you are able to type in all of the fillable forms once you download the guidebook. So you can interact with it and also save it as a team. And that way, as turnover takes place within SART teams, new folks would be able to go back and read through the entire guidebook and see the decision points and some of the notes of the conversation the team has had. In addition, that way, when teams are doing work with the case file review 5 years from now and are wondering what past case file reviews have looked like, they will have a document that they can refer back to see all of those decision-making points. All right, I'm going to take a quick pause and see if anyone has any questions about how the case file review workbook kind of functions as a document, and also take a sip of water. Okay, well, if folks have questions, again, feel free to chat them in as I continue talking. But essentially, that's what case file review looks like, as well as a little bit about the process of case file review. I always like to remind people that a lot of decisions go into evaluation processes, and it really depends on your team as far as what specifically fits your teams best. All of the activities in this guidebook were, for the most part, designed to be discussed through a 90-minute meeting. However, depending on your team and depending on how your team has conversations and communicates, some activities may take more time and some activities may take less time. Again, it just kind of depends on your team's relationships. All right. We are going to spend, how do you respect the confidentiality of victim survivors during case file review? Yeah, that's a great question. We do have a whole separate webinar discussing specifically case file review and confidentiality. But what I'll say about confidentiality, because this is a very common question, is oftentimes it starts with team members discussing and sharing their confidentiality requirements as it relates to case file review, and in general. It then goes into the team members making decisions as far as what information they want to share within the specific case file review process. So some teams decide that they are just going to look at the specific case and read through the specific case and write down their notes, while other teams decide, oh, we want this to be more of a conversation and we're going to share information outside of those case notes. We do have recommendations as well for redaction and what information to redact. And we also encourage teams to think about what identifying information or what information may be identifying specific victim survivors, specific folks that have worked on the case that may not be considered personal identifying information. And Heather just dropped the link. Oh, yep. Heather in the chat also dropped the link to our confidentiality toolkit, which goes into a lot of detail as far as what to think about with confidentiality. And in the guidebook itself, we do have an entire chapter and several activities devoted to discussing the needs of upholding confidentiality in case file review. And that is an example of an activity that might be a longer discussion than just one team meeting. All right. So when thinking about is your team ready for case file review? Are you ready for case file review? I want to point out that this next part of the discussion is based off of our readiness assessment, which is located at the very end of our foundations chapter of case file review. I've just divided it and presented it in a slightly different way than how it is listed in the guidebook itself. So when we're thinking about whether or not you're ready for case file review, we can think about it in various different terms. And I see we have a question about MOUs, and I think I'm going to hang on to that question until we talk about confidentiality in terms of readiness, if that's okay. So when we're thinking about whether or not a team is ready for case file review, one of the first things we want to ask ourselves is whether or not the team is willing to commit 10 to 15 months for the review process. Oftentimes, SARTs meet monthly. So another way of thinking about it is 15 or 10 to 15 team meetings are most likely going to be devoted to this process. And that's from the very beginning of discussing whether or not this process is the best form of evaluation for us, all the way to now we have a plan and we're going to develop some next steps based off of what we learned in the case file review process. Teams must also have a goal to identify and implement new strategies for a successful response to sexual violence. In other words, teams must be ready and willing to change how they are practicing and how they are responding to sexual violence in order for case file review to be effective. In addition, there has to be an agency that is willing to provide the actual case files to review. Oftentimes, this is either law enforcement or a prosecutor's office, depending on your community. And again, what case notes are actually looked at and reviewed might depend on what that agency is willing to share. And lastly, that the team has discussed some of the limitations as it relates to case file review and have really determined that case file review is the best evaluation process moving forward. So spending a little bit of time discussing the limitations of case file review, and kind of what case file review as a method can or cannot do for teams. So first, I would like to point out that this is really focused on evaluating sexual violence that occurs and has a response within the criminal legal system. So case file review may not be the best option for your team if you're looking at evaluating sexual violence that isn't documented within the criminal legal system. When we're thinking about police reports, there has to be a police report in order to review cases. Another one of the limitations of case file review is it really focuses on evaluating the organizational responses to sexual violence within the criminal legal system. So if there are services that are part of your response to sexual violence outside of that system, this may not be the best form of evaluation. So for example, oftentimes when I was an advocate, we had a mental health component and we had groups and we had therapy as part of our advocacy services. Those forms of the response to sexual violence are not going to be evaluated by reading a police report. So when we're thinking about what we want to learn about, we really want to make sure that it is based on the criminal legal system. And again, jumping off of that, case file review won't evaluate individual members of a discipline who are part of the response to sexual violence. And this includes both folks that work within the criminal legal system and folks that work outside of the criminal legal system. The goal of case file review is to really look at your system's response, not an individual member. Which is why we oftentimes recommend redacting or removing the names of specific folks that have worked on cases, so that we're really focused on what the system response looks like. Case file review isn't intended or meant to be a performance review. But rather a response to all of a review of the response to sexual violence in general. So when we think about team members and whether or not they are ready for case file review, we can think about team members in two different ways. So here at SBJI, we think about team members as the individuals that are on the team and who sit on the team themselves. And then we also think about team members as the discipline represented by that team member. So the discipline itself. When we're thinking about an individual and whether or not they are ready for case file review, it's thinking about, is that individual familiar with the current protocols of the team? Have they read the protocols and the policies and practices that the team has developed? Do they understand the role of each discipline represented within the team? So when we're thinking about this, I know when I was in advocacy, sometimes I needed to clarify what my role was with other systems professionals. And it's really ensuring that everyone understands what their role is within the response and what the limitations of that role is within the response. In addition, does that individual team member feel confident that they can explain the laws, ethics, and practices surrounding confidentiality in that role? So I want to go back to that question about memorandums of understanding. I'm just going to scroll. There we go. Okay. So we did have a question earlier in the chat asking, does an MOU allow you to speak freely and not have to redact? So part of that question depends on your discipline, right? As an advocate or as a medical forensic nurse, their confidentiality requirements and standards are a lot different compared to law enforcement or a prosecutor or a victim witness specialist. So it really depends on who you are and what your role is. For advocacy, oftentimes we have certain requirements that require us to maintain confidentiality. So from that perspective, an MOU wouldn't necessarily allow you to speak freely about a specific case. However, there are releases of information that folks can ask victim survivors to sign, and that can sometimes be a way that cases are not redacted. Oftentimes that is a team decision, and then that and a team conversation, whether or not we want to be asking victim survivors directly to review their case and what that would look like as far as redaction goes. I want to really encourage people that if they do want to go down that route, thinking about who is discussing with the victim survivor how their case is going to be reviewed, what that means for their case, and really emphasizing that participating in a case file review process won't necessarily change the individual outcome of that case, and really what the team is doing with that information. So that is an option, and it does change some disciplines' response as to whether or not they need to redact, but it is and can be a more like time-intensive process. So I hope that answers your question about MOUs. Confidentiality can get tricky, and I always encourage folks to reach out to attorneys like the Victim Rights Law Center to really understand their confidentiality requirements. So how do you review a case without using a name? Yeah, so oftentimes what I see in regards to redaction is the case notes will be completely printed out, and all of the names will be either replaced with victim or just blacked out, so that you cannot actually see the name of that survivor. Oftentimes when we're blacking out names or removing and redacting names, it's not only removing the name of the victim survivor, but also the name of the suspect, the name of any witnesses, and then it can also include removing things like addresses, where the sexual assault took place. I'm trying to think of other examples. Gender identity, depending on the case, it could also include if interpretation services were used, what interpretation services were used. And by removing all that information, then you're really focused on statements that are made within the police report, like advocacy was contacted at this time, or after we met with the victim survivor, they went and received a medical forensic exam at the hospital, and this is what happened after that exam occurred. So then you're really kind of focused on the connections that have been documented within the police report. Facilitate the meeting. Yeah, sorry, I'm just reading the chat. But as a SART coordinator, you usually facilitate that meeting and deciding what case will be reviewed with the team. So how do you ask law enforcement or DA for this information to present to the team? Give me 1 second as I think about your question. Without a name. So you can set parameters, and part of selecting what cases you want to review. So the question, and if I'm misunderstanding the question, please correct me. But if you're the site coordinator facilitating the meeting and determining what cases to review, how do you figure out how to describe those cases without a name? So you might not say, I want cases that are listed by or where the victim survivor's name is this and that, or like Jane Doe, and like have a specific list of names. But instead, what you can ask law enforcement or the DA's office is, we are looking for specific cases that occurred within this time frame. So it could be within the last 5 years. Depending on what your focus is, you could say where the outcome of the case had a specific, or whether it was a specific outcome of the case, whether that be it went to trial, it was dismissed at this point. Heather also typed in the chat that another parameter could include looking for specific types of cases like drug facilitated sexual assault. Those kind of like parameters. So you're not necessarily specifically listing out names, but you're describing parameters that your team is focused on learning more about. And then someone else put in the chat, should you always get case files from law enforcement or CAs in order to do a case file review? For this, I would say, and this is again kind of thinking about those limitations, oftentimes, yes, those case notes are coming directly from either law enforcement or some sort of prosecutor's office in order to be looked at from like a multidisciplinary perspective. And again, that is related to confidentiality and kind of getting other types of case notes, and having multiple disciplines looking at them does not uphold, like, for example, advocates' confidentiality standards, unless there is a release of information in place. So when we're thinking about case file review, and we'll get into like, well, what if that's not a possibility? But it is a really specific process, and it is a really specific form of evaluation. And teams are able to do other forms of evaluation. All right. So spending a little bit of time, talking about the individual and confidentiality. Another thing that I do want to point out with case file review is that challenging conversations and conflict is likely to occur. We all have, in a multidisciplinary team, different definitions as far as what success looks like, what we value, what we consider to be a helpful and safe response within our community. So case file review, oftentimes these disparities come up, and that's okay. But it is really a time for teams to come together and have those kind of challenging conversations. And sometimes that means team members may be in conflict with one another. And part of being ready to do case file review is being willing to move through those conflicts. In addition, as I mentioned before, when we're thinking about case file review and team members being ready, we're also thinking about the discipline itself as a team member. So I'm going to be talking about it in terms of the leadership of that discipline. So we want to ensure that the leadership of that discipline has had all of their questions answered, especially the agency that is providing the case notes. And also that the leadership is willing to support the team in the review. Again, case file review can take a long time. And we want to make sure that our team members are supported within the discipline. I saw Fatima turn on her camera.
Yes, there are a couple of questions. Do you have time to answer them now, Miranda, or would you like to wait till after?
We can talk about them now.
Okay.
Yeah.
The first question is, will these released case file reviews include forensic nursing notes if given to law enforcement?
Yeah, so typically I would say it, I know this isn't always the most helpful answer, but it really depends on your community and your agency. You can also limit the case notes to like specific pieces of information. So it could be like the narrative of the law enforcement police report are the case notes that you're reviewing. But that is a conversation to have with whoever is providing those case notes. to ensure and to have clarity that confidentiality standards will be upheld, and what information is exactly going to be provided.
And we have another question in the chat. Do you recommend a victim survivor survey to gather feedback from survivors as part of the case review? If so, does Min Casa have example surveys?
Yeah, so I would consider any sort of victim survivor survey to be a different form of evaluation. It could go in tangential to case file review, but I would really look at too, because like asking for that perspective might be focused on other forms of the response and other services that the victim survivor has received outside of that criminal legal system. So I haven't seen them happen at the same time, and I think I would be mindful of like the team's capacity when developing both at the same time, and just thinking about the expectations as far as how long folks want to be in the evaluation process, as well. But I do think asking for victim survivor feedback through the survey is a great form of evaluation.
We have another question. Realistically, how many cases would the SART get through in a year? And how would every case review need each step of the process?
Yeah. So as far as how many cases would the team get through in a year, I like to say that it takes about an hour to actually sit down and review each case. So oftentimes case file review, if done within an 8-hour day, you review about 8 cases at a time. Not every single case would every case review need each step of the process. Not every single case file review is going to look exactly the same, but depending on your team, if you have a lot of turnover, you might experience some of those same conversations. And some of those conversations might also change depending on how laws have changed over time, and how policies and protocols have changed over time as well. So oftentimes case file review, it's helpful to like focus on one specific form of learning, and to really like narrow down what you are wanting to learn about the case through the case file review process, so that it doesn't become an overwhelming form of evaluation. In our area.
Yes,
Oh, we
there's
have-
another question in the chat. In our area, there has been talk about doing case review for open cases. With confidentiality, is that even possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so here at SBJI, we discourage reviewing open cases because there are just so many factors that come into play when reviewing open cases, and how that can impact outcomes of the criminal legal response. So we don't necessarily recommend it. An acute response SART team where members of a discipline are gathering together to really look at one specific case and to support one specific case, might find open case file review helpful. But then I would question if that systems change work, or if we're really focusing on one individual, which are just a slightly different kind of work. When is it considered a closed case when it's done going through the legal system? Yeah. So we talk about, and within the workbook, we do have like a key terms kind of at the beginning where we defined closed cases. So when I think of closed cases, it's usually that case has gone through the criminal legal response as much as it is going to, right? So some cases are reported and then they may be declined for prosecution. Other cases might be reported to law enforcement and prosecution decides to charge that particular individual, and then they are resolved through a plea bargain. So all of those might be considered closed cases, but it's just that no active work is being done within the criminal legal response, and no active work will be done in the future of that particular case. And Fatima also dropped in the chat the difference between acute and system SARTs, going back to that question about reviewing open cases. All right. I'm loving all the questions. I'm going to continue talking as we have a couple of other slides as we wrap up here. So we have been talking a lot about kind of the limitations of case file review and what you need to be ready to do case file review. And oftentimes I've gotten to this point when talking with site coordinators, and the response has been, oh, our team might not be ready for case file review. And that's okay. At that point, it might be a good time to pause and have a couple of discussions with the team as far as where the team is at. The first question to ask the team is, are we ready for an evaluation process? Oftentimes I see teams like form right away, and maybe they're still in that kind of assessment piece where they're really looking at what our response looks like present day, and we're not ready to fully evaluate what we've done yet because we haven't done any work. So maybe we're not ready to evaluate quite yet, but we will be. Are there other methods of evaluation that can be used? So I know we talked about this briefly while answering a question, but case file review is just one form and one method of evaluation. We can do focus groups with victim survivors. We can do community assessments and community evaluations. There might be information that we want to learn about that case file review may not be able to tell us. And lastly, if after talking through those two questions, your team decides, well, we do really want to do case file review, or it's required for us to do case file review, then it's thinking about what steps do we need to take in order to get ready for case file review. And this can include things like maybe we need to have conversations with our law enforcement partners and really explain what we want to do with case file review or prosecution so that we're able to gather those case notes. And maybe we need to refocus and focus on building relationships within our team. So oftentimes I encourage team members to take a step back and really think about how we can get folks into that case file review process. In addition, we can also think about next steps if your team is ready for case file review and next steps after this webinar today. So feel free to meet with your team and discuss measuring the change and really think about, are we ready for evaluation? And is this the time to do evaluation? Also determine whether or not case file fits your needs as a team, and start narrowing your focus of case file review. I cannot emphasize this enough. Case file review can oftentimes feel like a very overwhelming process. And it's really important to take time to think about whether or not this is a process that we want to begin. Because I would not like to see folks get halfway through the case file review process and then realize, oh, wait, we actually want to learn about something outside of the criminal legal system, and this isn't the best method to do so. So it's really having a lot of those beginning conversations. Begin reading the case file review workbook and look at the conversations that we have kind of laid out in discussion questions and some of the activities that we have developed. And then last but not least, reach out to us. We love talking to teams about this process and about this method of case file review, and we can really sit down and brainstorm what works for your community and what focus would be most helpful for your team. So case file review is a very community specific process because you're looking at cases that happen within your community. And sometimes having those conversations with myself or Fatima or other staff at SVJI can really be a great first step. All right. So someone just had put in the chat, could case file review be as simple as making sure protocols and procedures are set up and working the way that they should? Yeah. So case file review can simply be sometimes is what we said we were going to do actually happening in reality as a team. Other questions or thoughts that folks have? I know we have a couple of moments left.
There's another question in the chat, Miranda. Is there a written action plan or template for training and preparing a team?
Yeah. I think the foundations chapter, all of those activities are kind of a general action plan that teams can modify to begin preparing the team. And then once the team has decided, yes, this is the process that we're going to do, that preparations chapter really dives into all of the different steps teams need to take in order to prepare. And the order in which the activities are listed will hopefully help teams like have some of those logistical conversations at the beginning, like determining those case parameters and determining confidentiality and redaction, so that behind the scenes confidentiality and redactions can be happening as team members are continuing to have conversations and discussions about values and focuses and developing observation forms. I see that a bunch of people in the chat are saying thank you. And I do want to point out that we have a survey asking you for feedback about today's webinar. So if you have time, we'll also send that survey out. So we would love to hear from you and what was helpful in regards to this webinar today and the resources. But I can stick around for a few extra minutes as people have questions. All right. Well, I know we'll give everyone a few minutes back in their day, but I also just wanted to put on the screen before we ended my contact information and Fatima's contact information, as well as our website. So feel free to reach out to us with any and all case file review questions or other technical assistance or training needs related to SARTs and multidisciplinary teams.